Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel, and today I just wanted to talk a bit about the books that I've been reading this week, which are here, plus another one that's digital. Anyway, apologies in advance, I'm a little bit ill this week, so my voice is a little huskier, or a little weaker, I guess, more than husky. So bear with me, but here we go. Let's talk a little bit about the books I read this week. So firstly, before I go into talking a bit more about some other bookery books, I read Hanna Komar's Ribwort, which is a collection of poetry written originally in Belarusian and then translated by the author herself. And I found this really interesting on several fronts, partly because I don't really... I realised as I was reading, I know very, very little about Belarus and especially the sort of political goings on recently. And so she writes really powerfully, I think, in this about the kind of state suppression of many sort of dissenting voices. So whether that is, historical, so she looks back at 1937 and, when a lot of poets were murdered or sort of ostracized in other ways. And then she talks about the kind of current day where the political situation is such that people feel incredibly unsafe. And there's a link in as well with Ukraine, when the attacks on Ukraine begin from Russia. Belarus has a sort of complicated role in all of this as both a nation that's sort of seen as linked with Russia, but also one that is homing Ukrainian refugees that come in. So there's this kind of complicated factor. But these are poems that really speak to that political situation. They're very bold and tender at times, but all of them speak to this real power of words to triumph over these sorts of moments of adversity and the kind of difficulty that comes with trying to hold things together when you can see things massively falling apart around you. So it's a really vital selection of poems that I just found really quite captivating. Next up, and kind of an interesting bedfellow with that book actually, Under the Frog by Tibor Fischer, which was shortlisted for the Booker in '93, and is a book that's kind of, I have to admit, I hadn't really heard of the author or knew really anything about them apart from this, that they'd been shortlisted. And so this book looks a lot at Hungary, and particularly Hungary's relationship to the rest of Europe and sort of internally, in the aftermath of World War II, and particularly just before they then had their own sort of political upheaval. And so a lot of this novel really traces these two male characters who are sort of just trying to live and kind of get through. And, the book in many ways has a lot of absurdity and humour and joy of these two male characters sort of linked up and kind of talking to each other and trying to, make it through the day. But there's a real undercurrent of something very, very dark, because we know, as this front cover probably hints at, there's sort of so much political upheaval going on that everything is sort of at risk of falling apart at any given moment. And so you've kind of got this state of fear with these two sort of slightly bumbling characters. And so it's all just a very weird and strange book, because it's sort of on one hand very funny and very silly, and on the other hand just so sort of dark and bleak. So it's a really interesting book overall, despite having said all that. It's really it's kind of one of those odd ones that I can imagine really standing out on a shortlist. I've still yet to read the rest of the shortlist, but yeah, it's just one of those sorts of books where you're like, this is something I know very little about, and is also being told in this slightly sort of off-kilter style that I found really quite engaging, but is also just, at the heart of it, incredibly dark. Next up, and keeping with the bookery theme, I read Gossip from the Forest by Thomas Kenneally, and this was shortlisted back in '75, and it's an interesting book in many ways. It's focused around the end of World War I, and particularly the kind of the attempts to end conflict more peacefully, and kind of sign the sort of armistice agreement, or kind of really end things on a sort of fair note. And so what you really get at the heart of it is these diplomats trying to outdo each other, or kind of try to come to some sort of agreement. But actually, the complicated thing that we keep finding is just that all of these people are obviously people as well as diplomats. And so what starts as sort of putting their political cards on the table soon turns into something a little bit more complicated, because we suddenly realize that there's not much that they can do at various points. And, you know, one of them refers to having, I think it's the German one, refers to having a French wife. And so we kind of just get this sense of how complicated parts of this thing are, that Europe's borders are quite porous and in some ways. And these countries are all trying to decide on something that will have massive ramifications for the rest of history, which they don't really, they understand, but they also can't conceive of how big that is. And so you just end up with a situation that's kind of absurd, because they're trying to put a form and shape to something so abstract and huge, all the while, you know, they are only a few people. There's an interesting conversation at one point where one of the diplomats talks to a chef that's there, and finds out that, you know, one of the chef's sons died in the war. And it sort of starts to bring it home for some of the characters that, yes, the war has affected people in a very real way. And so, yeah, this is the right thing that they're ending the war, but what are the terms by which this all happens? And, you know, nobody is really going to feel a sense of justice in amongst this. So I just thought it was really interesting in many, many ways. And last but not least, I read Hey Hun, Sales, Sisterhood, Supremacy. And this is a really bizarre, not a bizarre book, maybe it's unfair. It's an interesting book because I essentially this book delves into the world of multi-level marketing, which in some ways itself is a rebrand of pyramid schemes, or Ponzi schemes, or other things sort of similar to it. And so it kind of deals with this idea. It's the story from Emily Lynn Paulson, who lived it herself. She was herself a multi-level marketer. She recruited many people. She did a great deal of selling. And this is, you know, the first part of the book especially is really focused on her experiences of that, and it's a really complicated thing. She talks about how it has a lot of overlap with cults, and so people get brought in thinking this is going to change their life, thinking that they finally have a sense of community, that they finally belong, that they're valued, that they're loved, and ultimately it turns out that, you know, that hasn't always been the case, that they are often just tools in a game. They are people who make other people money. And it's incredibly damaging. And, you know, the only people really getting rich are the people right at the very top of that pyramid. And so it's a really interesting book in that sense. And she talks a lot about how her kind of problems with alcohol especially really ramp up during this time, because that's the thing that allows her to power on through not only being incredibly tired from all the work, but also the dealing with the emotional element of it. You know, it kind of blunts her emotions, where she doesn't really have to think about the fact that she's just sent out cold messages to hundreds of people to try and get them to do things, and she's basically lied to people, and, you know, her family life is in a mess, and all of those sorts of things. I think that part of the book, I think, by itself would have been great. And I think where it slightly falls off a cliff for me a bit is, as I mentioned in the title of the book, it mentions supremacy. And a large part of this book is talking about how multi-level marketing overlaps with various things around white supremacy. And although I don't disagree with the core premise of that, I think it's poorly explained in this book. As in, I think it's introduced as an idea that, like, oh yeah, because they're linked with white supremacy, and it never really develops that point. And so I found it a bit lacking in that respect, that I was sort of like, well, either include it and really go for it and explain why, or explain more about that, or don't include this at all. So I think that's the thing I found kind of jarring about this book personally, was that it almost then itself starts to feel like somebody is selling me a multi-level marketing style thing at me. Like, you know, it's sort of, there's this there's an element where I'm like, I don't know what I'm being sold, and I don't know, this doesn't feel like it has the like this part that really needs backing and research and what have you, doesn't feel like it has it. So that's my only gripe really with the book, but overall a really interesting sort of deep dive into what it's like to be on the front lines of being in multi-level marketing. So anyhow, those are the books that I read this week. My brain has not really allowed me to do a great deal of reading, as my brain is a bit sleepy, so hence the size of these books. But we'll be back on it again soon. I hope you're all doing really, really well and are keeping, looking after yourselves. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.